Khrushchev and Richard Nixon, who was at the time the vice president of the United States, they had this very interesting conversation, who's going to be living in freedom and capitalism and whatnot. And Khrushchev was better public speaker than Nixon was. In his Crimea annexation speech in March 2014, Putin kind of used Khrushchev as a prop, saying, well, he must have given Crimea to Ukraine because he felt guilty for the mass purges. Like, I'm sorry, excuse me, what about Stalin? Lenin he doesn't like because he doesn't like revolutions. So clearly Lenin and a revolution, that doesn't work at all. I come across this, Khrushchev was Ukrainian. Like, he wasn't. He was a Russian peasant from a peasant family in the Kursk region.
Now, you've written a book about your great-grandfather, the former Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, just for our viewers' benefits. Why do you call him an outlier of the system?
Well, he was an outlier of the system. It's a very big book. It's almost 1,000 pages. The book is in Russian, so since our interview is in English, I just want to make sure people know. Not that people would rush to buy it, but if they would like to, it's only in Russian. So one has to read Russian to be able to read it. He was an interesting character in many ways, not because he was my great-grandfather, but because he was, by his behavior, by the way he approached the world, he was a public politician. And that was already an amazing thing in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union didn't have the politicians. Soviet politics was not really politics. It's the functions of the apparatchiks. It's the kind of decisions that the state makes for the benefit of the people. But he was a public politician. He would speak. He would think on his feet. He was good at banter, kind of without prepared remarks. As some may remember or know, there was this very famous kitchen debates in Moscow in 1959 when America brought its exhibit of American way of life into Moscow, and Khrushchev and Richard Nixon, who was at the time the vice president of the United States, they had this very interesting conversation, who's going to be living in freedom and capitalism and whatnot. And Khrushchev was better public speaker than Nixon was, because Nixon was was stiff. He wasn't quick on his feet. So Khrushchev was a public politician. He was a politician that was very similar. I think that was another difference for the Soviets at the time. Suddenly they had a leader who was like them, who spoke like them, who looked like them, who wasn't standing on the high steps of the Lenin mausoleum on the Red Square. And so there was a distance between the leader and the people were unimaginably large. So he was actually going and speaking to the crowd and so on. But another and an important thing, he was such a devoted Stalin flunky, if I'm not afraid of this word. He was a Stalin servant. The photos of him when he looks at Stalin with such adoration. And so Stalin dies, and Khrushchev says, my hands are covered in blood up to the elbows, because I was a participant. We all were participant in Stalin purges and mass murders of people accused of being enemies of the state. We need to repent. And so then 1956 happens, the Stalinisation, and something that was an absolute amazing thing that happened, that kind of his policies did, his changes did, is that people stopped having fear of the state, and actually just returned with Putin. That fear of the state returned, but for many, many years, for over 50 years, for over a century, what was that? 70 plus, not century, sorry, half a century. For 70 plus years, fear of the state was essentially eliminated on mass scale from public thinking. And that was an outlier of the system, because the Russian system more likely to instill fear in the people rather than uninstill it. And that's what he did. He tried to uninstill fear.
The seeds of the current conflict are believed to have been sown in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. Crimea was transferred to Ukraine by your great-grandfather, Khrushchev, in the 1950s. Putin has been openly critical of Khrushchev for this decision. How do you view what your great-grandfather did back then?
Thank you. Well, I actually don't view anything. They're facts that Khrushchev did not do it. And I'm sure Vladimir Putin or his historians of Vladimir Putin, who himself sees himself as a historian, should know that. But it's a good propaganda story. You have to have somebody to blame for this. Because Crimea was transferred to the Russian Federation from Ukrainian Soviet Republic at the time in 1954. It was early 1954, January, February. Stalin died in March 1953. So Khrushchev was not the top man at the time in any way. He was the head of the Communist Party, but the Communist Party was one of the ruling bodies of the Soviet state. There were other people who were in charge of the Council of Ministers, and so on and so forth. So Khrushchev was one of those people who made this decision. If you look at documents, and I'm sure people, not Putin himself, although he likes documents, he shows documents to many leaders to prove his point. So if you look at documents, and he should look at them if he hasn't, there are no signature at any documents that actually sign off Crimea to Ukraine. So Khrushchev did not do it. Yes. The reason he's accused of this is that he thought it was a good idea. He absolutely thought it was a good idea. He thought that Ukraine, because there's no connection to the Russian Federation, but it was a connection to the Ukraine Republic, the Soviet Republic within the Soviet Union. It's very similar climate. They know how to do, the Ukrainians know how to do agriculture. So he thought that from the management point of view, that was a good idea. And others in the cabinet, which was not his cabinet, he was part of that cabinet, others in the cabinet thought it was a good idea too. And since he was the one who was basically a doer, he was the one who would go to Crimea and figure out how to be able to do this and so on. They just said, okay, well, it sounds good, sounds reasonable. But there was no even documents in which it said he was the one suggested it. I'm sure he was, but it really was a collective decision. But because Khrushchev worked in Ukraine for many years, and in fact, in many sources, I come across this. Oh, Khrushchev was Ukrainian. That he wasn't. He was a Russian peasant from a peasant family in the Kursk region, which is a Russian federation. It is on the border with Ukraine, but he was a Russian. But it's easy to make him as a propaganda to make, he was born in Ukraine and therefore he was helping them anyway. No, he wasn't. It was a managerial decision. It was easier to operate Crimea, to develop its agriculture from Ukraine. And that's all there is. There was no nationalist agenda. There was nothing. But over the years, when Khrushchev became a persona non grata, that outlier of the system, that, if we like Stalin, we hate Khrushchev. And over the years, after Khrushchev was ousted in 1964 and was sent to retirement, kind of the reformalization of Stalin's greatness became an important point of politics. And so the more you uplift Stalin, the more you downlift Khrushchev, the more Khrushchev goes down. And so once again, from the propaganda purposes, Khrushchev was a great patsy for Crimea. And that's why, of course, Putin uses him as an example of how all this, he must be, Putin doesn't say he must be Ukrainian, but others don't know. It's like, but he was also Ukrainian. In his Crimea annexation speech in March 2014, Putin kind of used Khrushchev as a prop, saying, well, he must have given Crimea to Ukraine because he felt guilty for the mass purges. Like, I'm sorry, excuse me? What about Stalin? So what, Khrushchev started the mass purges? So this is one of those, I mean, I teach propaganda. So for me, there's little details of how propaganda works are very important. So there's a little sleight of hand. So they were mass purges. Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine. We skip Stalin's name in this scenario. And people who don't know much, and let's face it, people today don't know much because there's a lot of convenience of Google and social media. Why bother? So that, oh, yes, mass purges, Khrushchev, Ukraine, Crimea. Yes, we found the guilty party.
Now, we've spoken about what Putin's stance overall is on your great-grandfather. But when we talk about other Soviet leaders like Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin, what is Putin's stance there?
Well, he likes Stalin. Stalin was a strong leader, World War II, victory. There's a lot of statues erected to Stalin, has been a lot of statues during Putin's reign, which is, by the way, 25 years, quarter century, quite a big chunk of time. Stalin was strong hand. And in fact, actually what's happening since the beginning of the war, the complete elimination of rights and freedoms and freedom of speech, and everybody can be accused of everything. You know, you have a Facebook like and you're suddenly criminal and an extremist and whatnot. These are very Stalin-esque methods. And in fact, they talk about the fact, oh, well, you know, maybe it's a little drastic, but okay, because during Stalin, that's how it was, and there was order. So they're using Stalin's methods in this complete elimination of a Russian civil society, which hasn't been eliminated yet, which is like, good for the civil society. It's still there to some degree. So Stalin is good. So obviously, as I said, you know, when Stalin goes up, Khrushchev would go down. So Khrushchev would go down for Crimea. He would go down announcing Stalin. They haven't decided on the Cuban Missile Crisis because on one hand, Khrushchev stood up to the West and the West sort of blinked. I mean, Khrushchev also blinked. They both blinked. Kennedy agreed with Khrushchev on certain concessions. But at the same time, Khrushchev was horrible because he actually blinked and he withdrew rockets from Cuba. He should have blown up Cuba. I mean, I'm laughing because sometimes it's an argument. He should have blown up Cuba in the United States just to make a point, just to make like those bombs and bombs and rockets are our strength. So that's his standing. So Khrushchev, as I said, down. Leonid Brezhnev is doing really well. He was the leader who came after Khrushchev, doing really well because there was oil wealth, and he was a mild-mannered person in a sense, like very decorative leader. So people remember his time as if it was a calm and stable. So Putin likes whatever is happening in Russia today, nothing is not stable at all. But this kind of propaganda of Brezhnev stability is there. Lenin he doesn't like because he doesn't like revolutions. So clearly Lenin and a revolution, that doesn't work at all. And we saw it during, I think there was a celebration, in 2017, there was a celebration of the 100 years of the Bolshevik Revolution. And there was a parade on the Red Square, and there was very little revolution in it. There was a lot of like, oh, how great Russian history is. A lot of it was great military history, but little about the revolution. And yet they like Lenin because Lenin is a connection between the times. I mean, the Soviet Union was great and powerful. It was with Lenin's name, and therefore we're not going to eliminate Lenin because we also want to be, or we say we are as great and powerful.
You know, as you know, your great-grandfather is famous for the de-Stalinization of the USSR. Khrushchev famously condemned the repressive and dictatorial governance style of Stalin. In comparison, Putin has painted a more positive picture of Stalin, which you've just been speaking about. Putin has praised Stalin for turning Russia into an industrialized nation and winning World War II. Putin has also admitted that Stalin was repressive too. Meanwhile, critics also draw comparisons between Putin and Stalin's style of holding and increasing power. What is your opinion? Has Putin brought back the Stalinism that your grandfather opposed?
Well, and I just said that. I mean, the repressions that are happening, it's exactly in the Stalinist manner. I mean, they really eliminate
Yeah.
every potential for criticism, which is exactly what Stalin was doing. But I mean, in some ways, the mistake, well, mistake, it's not, Putin does make mistakes. But if you analyze the actions, I would imagine the mistake is, so he talks about Stalin as the turning, he was responsible for turning the Soviet Union into industrialized nation, which is true. But Putin wants a superpower because his idea is also in a superpower. That's when when it's listened to, when it's considered an interlocutor. But actually, it was Khrushchev who turned the Soviet Union into a superpower, because the superpower began with with Sputnik, when the Soviet Union sent Sputnik into space, and then, of course, with Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut, the first astronaut, the first man in space in 1961. That's your superpower, because that's when the United States was working on it. The Soviets already did it. So in some ways, once again, kind of Putin is an interesting, or he used to be an interesting man in this sense. He is a man of all seasons. Like, whatever greatness there is in history, he would like to have it. They don't like Khrushchev. They denounce Khrushchev all the time, and yet they do want Gagarin, and Gagarin is Khrushchev. And so they kind of trying to eliminate Khrushchev and take Gagarin out of Khrushchev, to say, well, and under Stalin, somebody wrote about this, that under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a superpower. No, it didn't. Under Stalin, it was industrialized, but it wasn't a superpower. But because all the space programs and nuclear programs began under Stalin, by the way, in the Gulag, like there's all these great scientists were sitting in the Gulag and creating, having these great ideas. That must be Stalin too. It's like, no, Stalin may have had these ideas in the Gulag on paper, but under Khrushchev and his openness and his relative freedom, these ideas were able to flourish and become reality.